I'd never met Mark Knopfler from Dire Straits, but I'd always admired him as a guitarist. And so I was delighted when I approached him and asked if he would play on the song. He said, send me an MP3. I did, and he came back and he said, this is an excellent song, Thomas. You ought to come to my studio in London and record it. And so I went to British Grove Studios in London, which amazingly is about 100 metres from the house where I lived until I was 3 years old. And Mark has a beautiful, beautiful studio there called British Grove, which is relatively modern. And it's a studio that couldn't get built these days unless it was by a guy that was, had the luxury of being able to have a studio like that without renting it out all the time, because I can't imagine that it's always busy. They do string sessions and so on there, but it's such a gorgeous place. It's really the best of the old world and the new. He's got classic vintage Neve and API boards, lots of incredible collector's editions of compressors and limiters and EQs. But then he's also got state-of-the-art modern digital audio workstations. And what especially impressed me about Mark and his studio was that all the time we were recording, there's 2 or 3 guys at the back, like 19-year-olds, just sitting there taking notes. And I asked Mark what the deal was with these kids. And he said, well, you have to pass on the knowledge or else it's going to get lost. And he's dead right, because there's so few studios left these days and so few professional tracking dates taking place. There's still some vintage gear around, but the young kids coming through don't have the experience to know how to set it up and really work it. So my hat's absolutely off to Mark for keeping the knowledge alive. So Mark and I got settled in his studio, and I told him that the song to me was like a traditional folk lament with lots of verses and coming back to this refrain of the 17 Hills, and that I really wanted him to try and help the vocal to tell the story of these 2 young lovers whose lives went off the rails. So Mark picked up his guitar, and this is what he played. So, as you can imagine, I was fairly excited at this point that I was actually going to get the amazing, legendary Mark Knopfler on my record. But, the first take was a little bit hit and miss. There's a couple of nice licks in there. So, the last thing you want to do with a great musician is cramp their style. So, I had some notes in my mind, but I wasn't going to suggest them to him. I just tried to be encouraging, and I said, hey, that sounded great. Just give it another whirl and get used to where the vocal phrasing is. And so his next take sounded like this.
Shouting on God, mine
Yes, so you know, working with a musician like this is very much like being a film director. There are good directors and bad directors, and I mean, often when you want something to change, the wrong thing to do is actually tell the artist directly what you want them to do. You just need them to sort of pull it out of themselves. So sometimes it's good to get them to focus on something totally different. So I think I remember saying to Mark that it was starting to sound really good, but I liked it best when it was playful. So try and make it playful. So this was what the next take was like. So yeah, I'm liking this a lot. I'm liking it best when it really helps move the story along. And you know, I think I said to him that there's a sense of freedom, a sense of release when they finally get on the road in their convertible car, and they're heading out of town. And so maybe to bear that in mind, and it's almost like, you know, he's writing a soundtrack as he goes along to a sort of invisible Hollywood B movie. So this was his next take. So I'm noticing as each of these takes go by that there's a few little pieces here and there that that I'm going to be able to use in the eventual track, or maybe one of the takes is just going to hang together. So far I haven't heard anything that's quite fluent enough to work, but I remember mentioning that, you know, some of the gaps between the vocals are longer than others, and that one thing I hadn't heard yet was a really nice transition from the verse to the chorus. So I mentioned that to Mark, and on the next take he played this. So yeah, similarly for the entry, I hadn't yet heard a really good entry for the beginning of the verse, so we messed with a few different things and he came up with this. And I really like the way that came sliding in right after the flaming hair. So I had a sense now that we had most of the verse and the chorus, but I wanted something a bit different at the end of the chorus, because the chord sequence is a bit different there. It has a sort of rise and fall to it, like this. All I wanted was a place among those hills. This bit here. Didn't mean to hurt no one. No, least of all the girl I love. You know, it's kind of a tricky thing because I didn't want him to double the vocal exactly. I wanted him to sort of play around it. It would have been too corny to just double it in unison. So I said, I'll try a few different things. So. All I wanted was a place among those hills. Yeah, very iconic, that one, very MK, but unfortunately treading a little bit on the sensitivity of the vocal. Not that I would tell Mark that, of course. I probably said something like, you know, that sounded really nice. It just needs to weave around the vocal a bit as far as the phrasing goes. So here's the next one he did. All I wanted was a place among those hills. I didn't mean to hurt no one. No, least of all the girl I love. So yeah, now he's starting to get a lot more subtle. So, you know, if you're listening to this and you're a music fan but you've never actually been in a recording studio, you're probably thinking, this is insane. They go round and round the same pieces. I mean, look at all these takes. These are, what, 18 takes of Mark Knopfler playing just a few bars at the end of the song? Well, so as you can imagine, I mean, those 18 takes probably represent, I don't know, an hour and a half's work in the studio. And you'd think it would drive us crazy, but you know, part of the art of working in a studio is you have to have an ability to somewhat switch off your impulsive reaction every time the music plays and be a little bit more analytical, and sometimes less is more, and so it took us a while to get to it, but eventually he arrived at a point where, you know, he just played a very little bit at the end, and all I wanted was a place among those hills. I didn't mean to hurt no one. No, least of all the girls. And when I heard that go by, I'm just sort of thinking to myself, well, you know, it's a bit chunky in here, but you know, we can probably lose that. But there was something about that last little lick there that he did that was just right. So there comes a point in the session where you just really feel, you know, intuitively that you've got everything, and that to keep on working at it would just be counterproductive. So what I then do is, you know, I bring everything home and I start going through it, and I say, well, you know, I love this lick here, and so I click on this little arrow here, and hey presto, it goes up into what's called a comp track, which is this bit at the top. And then I love this lick down here, so I'm going to take that up. I like this bit here to here, take that up, and I'm going to give that a try and see how it sounds. So you just experiment a bit, and eventually you end up with a great combination of different tracks. And here, as if by magic, Julia Child's style, is one that I did yeah. Flaming hair, her name was Irene, the prettiest thing you've ever seen. Robbed the store and she shot on guard. Mine was the face on the TVR. Ran us down on the Delta, freight yacht rusting in the sun. All I wanted was a place among those hills. I didn't mean to hurt no one. No, least of all the girl I love. So there you have it. What's the worst job you ever had? Ooh, chopping up 23 takes of Mark Knopfler guitar solo.